everybody. Hello and happy Valentine's Day. I hope everybody's Valentine's Day is off to a wonderful start, or middle, I guess, since it is the afternoon. So we are going to continue reading from the most romantic book of all time, just in time for Valentine's Day, Pride and Prejudice, and this is written, of course, by Jane Austen. So we are at the point now where Mr. Darcy has made the acquaintance of Elizabeth Bennet. So we are going to pick back up where we left off last week. The day passed much as the day before or had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend. And in the evening, Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing room. The loo table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter and repeatedly calling off his attention by messengers to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at piquet, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Elizabeth took up some needlework and was sufficiently amused in attending to what had passed between Darcy and his companion. The perpetual commendations of his letter, the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in union with her opinion of each. How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive a letter! He made no answer. You write uncommonly fast. You are mistaken. I write rather slowly. How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year? Letters of business, too. How odious I should think of them. It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of yours. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her. I have already told her once by your desire. I am afraid that you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well. Thank you, but I can mend my own. How can you contrive to write so even? He was silent. Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table, and I will think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures until I write again? At present I have not room to do them justice. Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy? They are generally long, but whether always charming, it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a longer letter with ease cannot write ill. That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because she does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy? My style of writing is very different to yours. Oh, cried Miss Bingley, Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest. My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents. Your humility, Mr. Bingley, said Elizabeth, must disarm reproof. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. And which of the two you call my little recent piece of modesty? The indirect boast, for you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and carelessness of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always prized much by possessor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved upon quitting Netherfield, you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it sort of a privilege, a compliment to yourself. And yet, what is there so very laudable in perceptance, which I must leave very necessary business undone, and can be no real advantage to yourself or anyone else? Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much to remember at night, and all the foolish things that were said in the morning. And yet, upon my honor, I believe what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless perceptance merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say that you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know, and if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, Bingley, you had better stay till next week, you would probably do it. You would probably not go, and at another word you might stay a month. You have only proved by this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off now much more than he did himself. I am rather exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper. But I am afraid you are giving it a turn, which that gentleman did by no means intend, for he would certainly think better of me under circumstance if I were to give a flat denial and ride as fast as I could. When the ladies had removed from dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing that she was well guarded from cold, attended her into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her two friends with many professions of pleasure. And Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentlemen appeared. Their powers of conversation were considerable. They could describe an entertainment with accuracy, relate an anecdote with humor, and laugh at their acquaintance with spirit. But when the gentlemen entered, Jane was no longer the first object. Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned towards Darcy, and had something to say with a very polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow, and said he was very glad. But diffuseness and warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room, and she removed at his desire to the other side, and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his own open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. Darcy took up a book, and Miss Bingley did just the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, by any conversation. He merely answered a question and then read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused by her own book, she had only chosen it because it was the second volume of his. She gave a yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way! I declare it, after all, there is no such enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than a book! When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if it not have an excellent library. No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside the book, and cast her eyes around the room in quest for some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you, before you determine it, to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there is not some among us whom a ball would rather be a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing. As soon as Nicholas has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "if they were carried in on a different manner. But there is something so insufferably tedious in the usual process of such a meeting. It would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing were made the order of the day. Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I dare say, but it would not be near so much like making a ball." Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterwards she got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well. But Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one effort more, turning to Elizabeth and said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example, and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed to do it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up sure enough. He was as much awake to the novelty of attention in that quarter as Elizabeth herself could be, and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but declined it, observed that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether at all anyone could understand him. "Not at all," was her answer, "but depend on it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything, and persevered therefore in requiring an explanation of his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection in explaining them," said he, as soon as she allowed him to speak. "You either choose this method of passing the evening, because you are in each other's confidence and have secrets to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage of walking. If the first, I would be completely in your way, and if in the second, I can admire you much better if I sit by the fire." "Ooh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "I have never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "Nothing so easy if you have the inclination," said Elizabeth. "We can all plague and punish one another, tease him, laugh at him, intimidate him as you must know how it is to be done. But upon my honor, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Tease calmness of manner and presence of mind. No, feel he may defy us there. And as to laughter, we will not expose ourselves, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy may hug himself." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," cried Elizabeth. "That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to have many such acquaintances. I dearly love a laugh." "Miss Bingley," said he, "has given me more credit than can be. The wisest and the best of men, nay, the wisest and the best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke." "Certainly," replied Elizabeth, "there are such people, But I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise and good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without. Perhaps that is not possible for everyone, but it has been the study of my life to avoid such weaknesses, which are often expose a strong understanding to ridicule, such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will always be under good regulation. Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume, said Miss Bingley, and pray what was the result? I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise. No, said Darcy, I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I do not dare vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offenses against myself. My feelings are not puffed about with every attempt to move on them. My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion once lost is lost forever. That is failing indeed, cried Elizabeth. Implacable resentment is a shade in character. But you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, some natural defect which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect is to hate everybody. And yours, he replied with a smile, is willfully to misunderstand them. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of conversation in which she had no share. Louisa, will you not mind walking with Mr. Hurst? Her sister had not the smallest objection, and the piano was opened, and Darcy, after a few moments' recollection, was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. Ooh. Let's see what happens next. Alrighty. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to their mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughters remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before. Her answer, therefore, was no, at least not to Elizabeth's wishes, for she was impatient to get home. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, and in her script it was added that if Mr. Bingley and his sister pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them very well. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth was positively resolved, nor did she much expect it would be asked, and fearful, on the contrary, as being considered as intruding themselves needlessly long. She urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length it was settled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned, and the request made. The communication excited many professions of concern, and enough was said of them wishing to stay until at least the following day to work on Jane. Until the morrow, their going was deferred. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of one sister much exceeded her affection of the other. The master of the house heard with real sorrow that they were going too soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, that she was not enough recovered, but Jane was firm, where she felt herself to be right. To Mr. Darcy it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. she attracted him more than he would like. And Miss Bingley was uncivil to her and more teasing than usual to himself. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him. Nothing that could alleviate her with the hope of influencing his desires. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered mostly to his book and would not even look at her. One Sunday after morning service, the separation, so agreeable to almost all, took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at last very rapidly, as well as her affection for Jane, and when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see them either at Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her in the most tender way, she even shook hands with the former. Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest of spirits. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet wondered at their coming, and thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. But their father, though very laconic of his expressions of pleasure, was very glad to see them. He had felt their importance in the family circle. The evening conversation, when they were all assembled, had lost much of its animation, almost all its sense of absence of Jane and Elizabeth. They found Mary, as usual, deep in study of the thorough base and human nature, and had some extracts to admire, had some new observations of threadbare morality to listen to. Catherine and Lydia had information for them of a different sort. Much had been done and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined lately with their uncle. A private had been flogged, and it actually had been hinted that Colonel Forster was going to be married. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, "that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party." All right, and so that will actually do it for our book club this Sunday. Again, we are reading Pride and Prejudice. I will show you once more. And this is, of course, by Jane Austen. I will look and see what year this was written. It doesn't say, but I believe it was done in the 1830s, so it's almost 200 years old. And of course, we will resume reading this book next week on Sunday at this time. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you are having a fabulous Valentine's Day, and I will see you around very soon.